And without further ado, Paul will start our meeting.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. I'm particularly excited about today's panel. We're going to hear both the national perspective on small house and hear more about a very local small house model right here in Augusta. So looking forward to that. And before we get started, Michelle, I don't know if you had any greeting you wanted to do, or
oh gosh, Paul, no, I'm on the spot. No, I'll spare everyone this morning and just say good morning, Michelle Probert, Main Care Director. Nice to see you all again. I will only be able to join you for half an hour this morning, but look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to moderate our panel today.
Great. Thank you. Good morning. So I really just want to get right into our speakers. Our first speaker is Susan Ryan. Some of you in this council know Susan already. I've worked with her before. So Susan is wearing two interesting hats for us this morning. Number one, she's the co-chair of the Moving Forward Committee One, Moving Forward Coalition Committee One on person-centeredness, culture change, care planning, and quality of life. I can't believe you put all those topics in one committee, but never mind. And also she's the CEO of the Greenhouse Project, which many of you are familiar with. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating alternative living environments to traditional nursing homes. And further, the Greenhouse Project's mission is to fundamentally transform elder care in America. I think Susan's a big thinker based on what we know about her. So welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and it is truly my pleasure. And there are many familiar faces around the Zoom room today. And in fact, it was Ruta Kadanoff who reached out to me over 15 years ago and invited me to become part of the Greenhouse Project. And I can tell you it has radically changed my world. So Ruta, I will forever be grateful to what you did and really kind of helping me to just see and envision a different way. My background is nursing. And so certainly Dr. Barb Bowers on the call. I've gotten to know Barb through the years of research that she and her team have done on the greenhouse model, and just so enjoyed working with Barb even in her retirement, which probably not so much of a retirement. But nevertheless, I've been a nurse for decades, and it has been my passion in whatever job that I've done. It has been really to advance quality of life experiences for those that are living in our long-term care settings. I've also done some home care and have really, there was a time in my career when restraints were best practices, and I was a director of nursing. We tied people up to keep them from falling. And I knew it just didn't feel right, but that was best practice. So I would embark on a career in home care to really keep people out of those, what I term to be dreadful places. And I would stay in home care for another decade or so and realize that as wonderful as home care is, and I still love home care, it can be cost prohibitive and it can be socially isolating. So when I went back in 2001, it was with a real passion for reformation. And it was in 2005, I went to Tupelo to see the greenhouse model. Our organization did not adopt it, but we did something like it. So I know about household models from that perspective. But then in 2008, when I got that invitation from Ruta and I joined the Greenhouse Project team, like I said, it really brought my home care background and long-term care background together. So today I just invite you to really reimagine aging with me and to just explore what's possible thinking about the greenhouse model. This happens to be a greenhouse home licensed as skilled nursing that you're looking at. So on the next slide, what I thought I would do is, many of you might have heard a little bit about the Center for Innovation. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context and kind of who we are and where we've been since CFI was formed in 2015. We spent 10 years with the Robert Wood Johnson funded initiative to spread the greenhouse model across the country, 2005 to 2015. And it was under Capital Impact Partners. They were a community development financial institution that did lending to underserved communities. And for a while that worked, but in 2015, it was determined we needed to embark on our own and really create a 501c3 that really sought as its mission to be a catalyst for person-directed living and empowering cultures in the community of one's choice. So kind of a big, bold vision, mission, if you will, and Greenhouse was its only partner. Last year, we formed an alliance with the Pioneer Network, that culture change coalition that has state culture change coalitions, as well as it has been the convener of annual conferences for decades and has really brought like-minded people together to fuel and transform, to create a movement to really bring change. And last but not least is kind of a new learning platform. And I'll go to the next slide. And so you can just kind of drill down, not going to spend much time on the next slide, but just so you can kind of get an idea where things kind of fall within those three buckets underneath the Center for Innovation. Empower Ed is the newest one. It is an e-learning platform. We've just launched a person-directed living certificate. It's 12 modules that really kind of builds upon a CNA's ability to really grasp and understand what does it mean to really deliver person-directed living. We do a lot of virtual classrooms. We do work with Project Echo and do a lot of telementoring. And this is also where our culture change consultancy sits. So beyond the greenhouse development, there is a scope of work that we do under Empower Ed that is really helping to transform traditional environments and really think about it from a culture perspective. So on the next slide, we're going to go rather quickly through many of these. I thought what I'd do is just kind of set the context. So in the next slide, here's where we are with nursing homes, 15,000. And I can tell you, I just read an article this morning, I believe it was in McKnight's, and they talked about the nursing homes that are projected to close because of the staffing standards that are going to be released, and that it's just kind of a recipe for disaster. Right now, we're about 15,000. And when you think about them, when were they built? They were built when Medicaid, Medicare started funding them. So there was an explosion of growth between 1966 and 1975. What were they modeled after? We all know this. They were modeled after hospitals. So very institutional. We kind of grabbed what hospitals were doing and said, well, that makes sense for us. We wanted efficiency. And that's where we focus. How do we gain the greatest efficiency? So how well did we do? And so you see the quote up there that I grabbed. And just for reference, I started my nursing career in 1977. And halfway houses between society and the cemetery for the elderly. This was the commentary by a senator in the state of Arkansas. So not such a great place. So on the next slide, what did we do about it? It's not that we sat idly by, but there was a Nursing Home Reform Act. Many of you probably remember it. I certainly remember it, and really had high hopes that that would kind of transform those environments that just didn't seem right. So in 1987, OBRA, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, was introduced. And if you remember, it was so that each resident would attain or maintain their highest practicable level of well-being. So we wanted to start seeing people that lived in nursing homes as those that had psychosocial needs, as well as just kind of the physical needs. So let's go to the next slide. How well did that reform do for us? Well, along comes COVID in 2020. So this is decades later. And here we are, a pandemic hits. And this is what Betsy McCoffey, a former lieutenant governor of the state of New York, will never forget the headlines in a New York Times. And I've captured some of it. Referring to nursing homes, she said they're death pits. They're crowded, they're understaffed. And this was before we have staffing standards that they're proposing. So on the next slide, once again, we an investigative study was done on nursing homes. It was an 18-month study. A 600-page report was generated. from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And it really was, it synthesized it. There's a summary page you can see that has 7 goals with recommendations beneath each goal. Lauren referenced the Moving Forward Coalition. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. So let's go to the next slide. So you can see from an occupancy perspective, you see that precipitous dip in 2020. What happened when COVID hit? Well, it dipped tremendously. And the next slide, you will see that nursing homes, what aging adults would say, and you hit it again and you'll see what they say. They say, whatever happens, don't send me to a nursing home. I've heard some say, I'd rather die than move into a nursing home. So we've not created places where people want to live. And certainly during COVID, it was a place that, no, just take me back home. I don't want to go to those places. So on the next slide, I want to contrast the experiences of COVID cases and COVID mortality rates in greenhouse homes as compared to traditional. And you will see COVID cases represented in the graphs on the left and COVID deaths on the right. We worked with Dr. Cheryl Zimmerman out of the University of North Carolina in the pandemic. It was in April of 2020 that we connected, and she says, I think greenhouse homes. Cheryl, along with Dr. Bowers, had done many research studies on the greenhouse model, and she said, I just believe in my heart greenhouse will do better. Created the methodology for us to capture data on a monthly occurrence. So you can see greenhouse, obviously in green, we outperform traditional by leaps and bounds. On the next slide, we missed 2021. I don't know what happened, but nevertheless, we kept doing it in 2021 as well. And once again, even when the vaccines came out, the greenhouse homes did far better. But here is something that, you know, how did we do in occupancy? During the pandemic, when we looked at our data, we were 93% full compared with a 70% average for traditional nursing homes. When you look at turnover, even with all the great resignation and everything else, we had a 29% turnover with frontline caregivers compared to close to 130% in our traditional counterparts. And once again, from that quality perspective, it was residents and families that were feeling much more satisfied by those connections that they had in the greenhouse home. Next slide. There's the 21 data. So somehow I must have gotten it mixed up. So you can see once again, as the vaccines came in, and then variants kind of merged later that year, but greenhouse continued to perform well. Next slide. So this is a greenhouse home, and I really, you know, I'm just going to throw greenhouse out as a solution for something that we should think about as you're trying to create a vision for what does it look like in Maine for nursing homes. This is one of 2 homes in Rochester, New York, licensed as a skilled nursing. There are 10 individuals that live in this home and one that's adjacent to that. Next slide. So the greenhouse model really begins with acknowledging our shared humanity. And it really is, what would you need? If you were to move into a long-term care community, a nursing home, what would you need to live life on your own terms? And it's acknowledging that my needs, your needs, they don't change as we age. In fact, I think I've become even more determined. This is what I want, and this is what I need. This is when I want it. So that autonomy and control for me becomes even stronger. So instead of us and them, what did they need? It's what do we need as humans to live life with some autonomy control? On the next slide, this is kind of a summation slide. It's when we think about the model, it's really radically transforming the paradigm. It's not just tweaking, but it's really radically shifting from an institutional to one that is comprehensively changing the physical environment. It's really thinking about the philosophical culture. And last but not least, it's the organizational structure. And Barb Bowers would tell you that's one of the most important things. It's not just those other things. So that we have sustainable change, that really it's not just change du jour, but it really is going to last over time. Next slide, and we're going to go through these next slides rather quickly. So here's Real Home in Colorado, and it's really normalizing our environment. So it looks like, it feels like, it says to a person, this is real home. I'm not living in an institution. Next slide. So whether it is an urban setting, and these are different expressions of the greenhouse model, they're not all single family homes, whether you're in Boston or you're in Pompano Beach, Florida, or you're in Minnesota or Birmingham, Alabama, Real Home comes in different shapes and sizes, and it looks similar to the community in which it's situated. Next slide. A Real Home is about warm and inviting spaces. This is a living room in the Leonard Florence Center for Living in Boston, Massachusetts. It invites intergenerational opportunities. Once again, normalcy. On the next slide. It's about private rooms and baths. And I want you to think about the pandemic and think about if you were living in a room with another person, maybe it was one, maybe it was two, maybe it was three. The nursing home up the street from me had 104 beds. They were 52 rooms, all 4-bed wards. And not to wonder, they had about an 80% COVID infection rate. And they lost about a third of their residents succumbed to the virus. So private rooms and showers, think about how powerful that was in mitigating the spread and the devastation of the virus. Next slide. I think the other thing for me, access to outside. Think about if during the pandemic, you were quarantined to your room with that person in the other bed or the 2 or 3 others that might be in the same room with you. Think about what happens when we were able to get outside from a mobility perspective, from a mood perspective, just the vitamin D, the sunshine, the fresh air, the opportunity. And these were both pictures captured during the pandemic, where others were quarantined to their room. The small size enabled these elders to be able to get outside and do some of the things that perhaps you or I would have wanted to do, or perhaps we did during the pandemic. Next slide. Real Home is, you've got kitchens. So we've decentralized all the dining and dietary departments. So it's a kitchen. And access, once again, Barb's research would tell you that early detection is important. And so being able to supplement and give some nutrition and hydration to somebody who needed it, to prevent hospitalizations, to be able to treat in the home because you've got the kitchen right there. Carts weren't coming in and out of these small homes, but instead they had just the same consistent staff working in this home with access to these things. Next slide. So that's the physical environment, and I love the physical environment. It's Real Home. Who wouldn't love it? But if you reduce it to that, we've missed a big part. It's deinstitutionalizing, destigmatizing the culture that's going in, and it's in a context of relationships. So on the next slide, it's really about seeing the person first. Let's not look at their diagnosis, their disability, their disease, but let's see the person. Let's recognize that this person has intrinsic worth and value, and that person is an individual, and understanding what that person needs to live a life with meaning and purpose. On the next slide, it happens in a context of relationships. And again, really understanding who that person is. And relationships happen once again through consistency in the staff that are going in that home. Think about the small size, that dedicated, consistent staff being able to form deep, knowing relationships. Next slide. Once again, it's not just living your day, but it's living with meaning and purpose. It's not just having your care needs checked off, but it's saying, how does my day get filled with meaning and purpose? Next slide. So last but not least, it is the empowered staff. It's the organizational paradigm that really gets shifted. It's really about flattening the hierarchy and really valuing those that are working closest to the elder. Next slide. Perhaps many of you have a greenhouse, one word, and you're able to have the environment that produces optimal growth in plants. Love that. Greenhouse 2 words is about what's the environment that will really help to produce growth in those that both live and work there. On the next slide. So it's that philosophy that is really prioritizing growth in people. And it really is looking at not just the elder or the residents that are there, but it's looking at the staff that are those that are working in those environments. On the next slide. So when you think about person-directed living, when you really want to advance person-centered care, person-directed living, to me, it's important. You've got to understand the inextricable link between empowering the workforce. You can't separate it, say, this is what we want, person-centered care or person-directed living. It's all about that link. And if to get there, we need to empower workers. So on the next slide, I will draw your attention to the italics. So it's really about creating the conditions where all of those in communities are supported to live their best and most fulfilling life possible. So both those that live there, those that work there, and valuing their growth as people and as individuals. So next slide. Similarly to the elder or residents, it's about seeing the person and understanding that direct care worker, that person, as somebody who has intrinsic value and worth, not marginalized, but really truly valued. The next slide. Staff empowerment in the greenhouse model, and this is another thing I think was especially powerful during the pandemic. They work as a versatile worker or a universal worker, and they do a myriad of things. They provide the care, they do the cooking, they do the cleaning, they do the laundry, and they meaningfully engage those in the home. So you've got more direct care staff and less of the ancillary staff that are coming back and forth. Next slide. I have a mantra. It's all about relationships, but it's also all about leadership. And it really is about culture and how leaders will embrace a coaching, collaborative, and compassionate culture that really seeks to value all voices and make sure that they're sharing decision-making, they're sharing power, and that we're doing all that we can to equip them for greatest success. A lot of education goes into it to ensure their core competencies, that they have what they need to be successful. On the next slide, I read a book during the pandemic that I would draw your attention to if you like research and if you really want to understand what worked well during the pandemic. The book is Compassionate Leadership. It's by Michael West. It's out of the UK. It was sent to me during the pandemic, and I loved it. This is something I grabbed from there. And I think it has everything to do when we think about an empowered workforce. It's meeting their core work needs. It's the ABCs, if you will, of meeting those needs. A is autonomy and control, whether you're a resident or you're a worker, you or I. This is important, the need to have control over our work lives and to make sure our work life and our values are aligned. B is belonging, that it's you want to be connected, you want to be cared for, and you want to feel valued, respected, and that you belong. That's about the culture that really seeks to make sure that we're meeting that need of our employees. C is contribution and competence. And that's to really make sure that we feel like we're contributing, we feel like we're competent, and that we're effective, and we connect what we're bringing to our quality outcomes. On the next slide. So the final quote here I'm going to put, when we think about recruiting and retaining, we're not just trying to get warm bodies into a culture that is very institutional in nature. We are really trying to connect people to their purpose, where value lies in our ability to contribute to something greater than ourselves, to grow as individuals, and to build community. It was a quote from Compassionate Leadership. So the next slide, I'm going to move us to moving forward. You could go to the next slide. So goal one, you kind of read the goal one, of which I'm delighted to be a co-chair for. And it really is, getting to the heart of person-centered, equitable care, and really getting to that quality of life experience to balance really the autonomy with the risk And Mary Lou is on the call today, and I can't tell you what a joy it is to be working with her. And she's leading a big part of what we're doing in this Goal 1, and really trying to create a care planning guide that could be an incredible resource to really help us get to what Goal 1 is really trying to accomplish here. So delighted for all that, all those that are working on this committee and the work that's being generated. Movingforwardcoalition.org is the website. I invite you to go and really drill down on the action plans that we are doing there. The next slide, in addition to this part of Goal 1, Goal 1, Recommendation 1E, is about changing the physical plant environment. And it really is, how do we get to smaller, more home-like environments? How do we get to private rooms and bathrooms? Because if we know that that's the best way to mitigate the spread of infection, and if we know that from a person-centered perspective, who wants to live in a 3 or 4 bed ward or even a semi-private room? So how can we really make sure that we're doing everything we can here? Delighted to be working with Charlie Sabatino. Perhaps some of you know Charlie. Charlie is an amazing person, was the director of the American Bar Association until he retired. And when I invited Charlie to be a part of this, he said, I'm coming out of retirement because this is important. On the next slide, delighted to be working in collaboration with Goal 4 as it pertains to Goal 1 and the recommendation for physical plant environments, and really thinking about how do we create a more rational and robust financial system. And so really thinking about what are the incentives and what can we do to think about funding and financing these environments, and what are the incentives. On the next slide, I would really encourage you to go to movingforwardcoalition.org. So they have the action plans are there, and you can see exactly what we are doing in collaboration with Goal 4 to really look at the HUD 232 program, to really look at states and how do we incentivize reimbursement. I'm going to give you a couple quick examples. In the state of Ohio, there has just been a modification to the Medicaid reimbursement rate. There's a quality bump in reimbursement. There is a private room bump in reimbursement. We've got greenhouse homes, 47 greenhouse homes across the state under one organizational umbrella, and that is Otterbein Senior Life, our largest not-for-profit owner-operator of greenhouse homes in that state. Arkansas is the other state that has the largest number of greenhouse homes, and it's a for-profit, and he has 53 greenhouse homes across the state. And early on, he really worked with the Office of Long-Term Care there to be able to get a bump, a Medicaid reimbursement incentive for doing the small house model. And so in his Medicaid reimbursement, and both of these communities have about 70% Medicaid living in their greenhouse homes. Incentives matter, and it's important for us to incentivize what we want to see in our future. So the last few slides, and I'll again go rather quickly. What are the opportunities? Next slide. I would invite you to really start thinking about what's your vision? What is the comprehensive vision that you want to create for your state? What are the shared and inspiring long-term goals that are really will be centered around that? I invite you to build on what's working. We've got some things out there that work well. The Moving Forward Coalition has assimilated some incredible thought leaders to give you some action plans and some ideas for ways to go forward. But be bold in what you do. And finally, I say, are you tweaking or are you going to transform systems? I think our tweaks, I can speak for myself, and having done something like Greenhouse, did a whole lot of tweaking, not a whole lot of transforming. So I invite you to, think about it from that perspective. Next slide. Support and accountability. I'm a big fan of increasing reimbursement. And it's not just let's throw more money to solve a problem, but what are we putting that money into, and how do we use support in the form of incentives? And how do we then have some transparency and accountability? Once again, those 7 comprehensive goals with the NASM report talks all about support and accountability, and I would invite you to do the same. Next slide. I think we've got to be honest and say, you know, money follows what we value, and we've got to acknowledge the ageism, the societal stigmas, the stereotypes around aging adults. I think we've also got to think about the other isms and the racism and all the other isms that really, the ableism, that are really impeding our flow of progress. It's time to shift our beliefs and our mindsets. Next slide. So lest you think I'm saying, wait until you get the big vision, I'm not, because I'm hoping that you heard something that was said today where you can immediately take action, even if it's a personal transformation, something that inspired you to think differently. Take action today on that one thing. Think about what's next in the next 3 to 6 months and what you can do. And finally, what will take place in the next year, and who do you need to get a part to be a part of it? What resources do you need? And next slide. I'll close with this. This is a moment in history where we must rise to the challenge of changing organizational and societal cultures to value every human equally and to ensure there's equity and care for all. The next slide is just Think Like a Disruptor. It's the Greenhouse Project's website, and I invite you to check it out. But thanks so much for your time. Back to you, Lauren.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. You know, I just have one quick, I know there's going to be a lot of comments and questions. So of the, I don't know, there's over 350 greenhouses in Greenhouse Project houses in this country in 32, 33 states. Do most of them get built from the ground up, or are some of them renovations?
Overwhelmingly, the majority have been built from the ground up.
Yeah.
I think, you know, so we did have some that tried to do the renovation and get as close as they could, but I think we find that typically it's more costly than you might believe, and that some of that aging infrastructure doesn't have the plumbing, it doesn't have all the necessary supports. There's so much that needs to be done that it gets very costly, and you don't really always get to, if you've got the land, then, you know, it's always better to build fresh. But it doesn't mean that we haven't done some renovation in traditional homes.
Yep. Judy, do you have a question? I see. Do you want to take that one on?
Sorry. Sure. Thanks, Susan. This is really a terrific presentation. Could you talk a little bit about the level of skilled care that you think is appropriate for the model? And do you find that most residents are able to stay in this model over time, or do you have to move them to a different model later?
No, actually, and I'll just share very quick. I was visiting the Leonard Florence Center for Living in Boston, Massachusetts last week. I was actually with some folks from Australia that were studying innovation in the US and came to see that home. And we were introduced to a gentleman who's living on their ALS unit. One of their homes there is supporting people living with Lou Gehrig's disease. And they also have a home that is a ventilator. 100% of those living there during COVID, they were asked to open a unit for individuals living on ventilators. And what they've been able to do, I'll just share quickly, they have what they call an outward bound program where they're able to get these people outside to their weddings of loved ones, to sporting events and all sorts of things through their incredible passion for normalcy. So yes, you know, what does it take? It takes a respiratory therapist, it takes a nurse, it takes certainly the care partner to be able to do it. But these are people that are supported to the very end of their life. And we find that in greenhouse homes all across the country, that they bring hospice in, those deep knowing relationships really support end of life and palliative care in ways that you can't imagine. I mean, it's like home. And I'm glad Barb's piping up. I was going to refer a very strong clinical base. Yes, for sure.
I just have to say, having toured that several years ago, it's an incredible place. And yeah, I, as a nurse, looking at some of the acuity that they had there, I was extremely impressed.
You and me both.
Yeah, I would actually venture to say, and this is also in the research that Dave Grabowski did, that the clinical outcomes are actually better in greenhouse homes than in traditional nursing homes. So it's an interesting, I'll talk about this later, blend between quality of care and quality of life that basically they each support each other, as opposed to trying to figure out, we'll do the clinical, and then if we have time, we'll do the quality of life stuff.
And I think that that was probably, you know, sort of visually appreciated during COVID, right? The fact that, you know, these pretty little houses actually did a better job of keeping residents safe and alive, right?
You know, just to that point, Lauren, it was really interesting. In May, as I was reaching out to some of our greenhouse communities, we started a webinar series in June. And we just thought, how are greenhouse homes faring during the pandemic? And we did a series called Elevate, Rise Above the Chaos. And so we really kind of honed in on how they were living those values amid such a horrific, uncertain period of time. And I was just amazed at the creativity and obviously how well those core values worked in the toughest of times. So that, I mean, yes, it was a tough time. I'm not trying to minimize the challenges of uncertainty and everything else that we all experience. But I will tell you, what happened in greenhouse homes was some of the most inspiring parts of my tenure at Greenhouse. I truly just lived with inspiration as we captured
I think
the stories.
sorry. Yeah.
Ruta.
Barb, if you wanted to add to
Nope.
that first, go ahead. Okay.
Oh. Nope.
Okay. My question was going to be about what you're seeing today, Susan, with regard to staff recruitment, retention, you know, in this challenging workforce environment. I know what the situation was in the past. It was significantly easier to hire and retain staff in the greenhouse model, but I'm just wondering whether that's continuing to hold.
It is continuing to hold. I will tell you though, it's again, you know, just getting out last week, I was also in Rhode Island at the greenhouse homes there. And depending on kind of where you are, COVID cases are surging again. And, you know, they were wearing masks and, you know, the testing and different things that they're going through. It does wear on somebody. But in spite of that, you know, I talked to Shabazz, the CNA who was in there preparing lunch. And she's been there since they opened. I mean, she was in their traditional building and she's now there. And she just says, you know, we're going through it together again. And, you know, year in and year out. So it really, you know, I think the qualifier is it's all about leadership. And I can tell you that leaders that really fully embrace and go all in to really embrace that culture and to really support the workers. I mean, we looked at wages, we looked at compensation, we looked at benefits, and going back to Leonard Florence, one thing I love, they haven't used any agency staff. And the other thing they do, they give them a mandatory, you got to take a day off, and here's $150 to go. It doesn't come out of your PTO. You go take care of yourself. It's your well-being day and go spend it the way you want. And it's incredible what they've done. Again, the creativity, the leadership, when they fully embrace what's happening. That's why I'm saying build on what's working well. And how do we capture the essence of leaders like that who are creating those types of cultures?
You know what, we have another speaker, and I think we can take these two questions from Mary Lou and Rich. Mary Lou first.
Or just quickly, Susan, thank you so much for being here. It is so inspiring to listen to you. I have just a quick question for you, and you may or may not know the answer. I know that Charlie Sabatino was in touch with some architects, well, maybe several, but one in specifically in Chicago about designs that could transform a traditional building into a more greenhouse-y type model. And I'm wondering if you have any update on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually put together a survey, and we're trying to learn from those who have working with architects. We're also, we've kind of distributed the survey link on social media and different things. And we're really trying to say, what have you done and what were the outcomes, and really trying to drill down on who's done what, so that we can really identify, you know, how's it working? And how do we then kind of build a stronger case for embracing the small household model?
Rich?
Thank you. That was great. I'm very familiar with the greenhouse model and also other, small house and Eden alternative philosophies. I'm curious. So many of our assisted living facilities in Maine have sort of adopted a greenhouse model like model where they're smaller facilities, they're private pay, and these private pay facilities are costing $12,000 to $15,000 a month. And some of these are some nonprofit organizations, facilities that own facilities, they need to have large skilled censuses to offset the cost for MaineCare. I'm trying to understand the finances because some of these organizations, which I have very high regard for, who really struggle to make it work, and they have the private pay that's very, very costly. They have the skilled census of 20, 30, 40 people to subsidize the cost of MaineCare. I can't imagine that MaineCare is going to reimburse $500 a day for people to live in facilities like this. So we don't have to, I know it's very complicated, but I'd really be interested in the finances about this.
Well, I'm going to do a real quick plug for a webinar. Jill Wilson will be really drilling down onto the finances on December 7th at a webinar that we're doing. She spoke at our conference, and it's powerful. And she kind of tells you what they need to do to make it work and how she advocated at the state level to really get that quality bump in the private pay bump. But she developed a workforce task force, a whole department that said, we're not going to compromise on compensation for the direct care staff. We're going to really make sure that we don't take money from them. It's getting a payer mix. It's, private pay, Medicare and Medicaid. How do you get the balance? And how do you, again, incentives matter. And finances are a whole other topic. And, at some point, if you'd like to connect offline, happy to, kind of drill down and connect you to some people to really take a look at it, because they are those that are doing it. A for-profit is doing it in Arkansas, not-for-profit in Ohio, the largest complement of homes under an organization's umbrella.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we'll move on. It was wonderful. Hopefully we'll have more time for more discussion later, but I want to move on to Jake Anderson, who's one of our advisory council members. Jake has been a long-term care administrator for, I think, about 12 years. Since 2016, he's been at the Maine Veterans Home in Augusta, is the administrator of the multi-level small house model at that facility. I think they opened their small house in March of 2022. And so Jake is here to share his organization's small house journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
So just briefly about myself, I'm an occupational therapist by trade. So, my bones are, the wellness aspect of each of the individuals that we care for. And that really has found its way into my leadership style and how we have operated both in the old institutional setting and then now here in our new model. I have been in healthcare for a number of years and in leadership specifically for the last 15 or so. Biggest challenge of my life is certainly embarking on the culture change commitment for a small house model, and then sprinkle a little bit of a pandemic throughout that journey for us. Definitely made for some exciting times. So I'm going to speak at a high level. You'll hear a lot of information and language that is very similar to the previous presentation. We had partnered with a consultant throughout our project who was part of the original Mississippi Homes, Jude Rabig. So a lot of the theory and the language we use is very similar to the greenhouse model. We are a small house model. We are not a greenhouse model. As we were beginning our project, some of our organizational priorities and opinions shied just a little bit different with how we were intending on operating. And openly some nerves about being the first of its kind in the state and really embarking on language changes to roles and those sorts of things. So they took some cautious steps as we embarked on the small house versus the greenhouse model. Go ahead, next slide, Sarah. So as we got started, our original home was exactly as it was painted a few minutes ago. Built in the early 80s, modeled after the hospitals, built around the institutional setting that is built on efficiency and infection control and clinical outcomes, not necessarily quality of life. And it definitely looked and felt that way, despite the best efforts of our organization as a not-for-profit to put money into programming, put money into physical plant, put money into experience for our residents. You can't shake that when you're in an institutional living and having a cubicle curtain between you and the next person beside you. The long halls and corridors. So we were in the position where we needed to evaluate, and was a renovation going to meet the needs of our residents? Was it going to be new construction? And the lack of program space and the need of our stakeholders, those being our residents, to really have their world change drove us to making a pretty drastic decision. And that was to abandon the institutional living that we had known and come to make everybody love, to now a different world. And as we started that process with our residents, clearly they had identified that, private space, their own space, their opportunity to not have to live with somebody that they don't know, was a huge driving factor. They also were open with us that, the concept of, the small house model and us building a home for them was also wonderful, but within that, they would still feel trapped. So as we began our design process, we wanted to make sure that we had engagement opportunities, that there was outside space for them to continue to do what they love, that there was inside space for them to, again, have some place to go, so that their new world wasn't then confining them to these new homes or houses that we constructed for them, but still gave them opportunity to access community and have that be a big theme. One of the core principles of our goal was to expand their world and make sure that they had access to as much as possible, and also give them more opportunity to spend with their loved ones. Our residents like us because they have to. They love their families, and I know I have done it, and I say it, kind of tongue in cheek on some of the tours that I do. Everybody has visited a nursing home in their life, and it's that guilt-driven checking the box that you're going to see Aunt Rita, you're going to see your grandmother, and it's a 15-minute so that you yourself can say, I went to the nursing home to see my loved one, and then off you go. It's those sort of interactions that our residents crave. And as we began our process, we wanted to make sure that our residents had as many opportunities to turn that 15-minute guilt-driven visit to a nursing home back into an engagement opportunity. So whether that's, they're going to see a movie with their loved ones in our movie theater, or a spouse coming to pick up their loved one to take them to the barber shop and then get an ice cream at the ice cream parlor and sit out on the front deck, opportunities to expand their world from those guilt-driven visits, sitting around with other folks that they don't know, to those engagement opportunities again with their loved ones. And then the last component to us getting started was access to funding. Over half of our project was grant funded through the Veterans Administration. There was CLC grants specific to a small house model, along with meeting their requirements for their CLC. So there were some dynamics to, again, push us, with grant funding towards this world of the small house model, and thankfully away from the institutional living that we came from. Next slide, Sarah. So looking at the our schedule and milestones, we were an 8-year project, and our organization spent its due diligence on research and development, looking at different organizations, trying to learn as much as they can. What did they learn from their project? What have they learned since occupancy, to help avoid and give us opportunities to be as successful as possible? with it being the first in the state of Maine, warming the soil for key stakeholders, obviously included our residents and family members first and foremost. They had to understand where we were headed, their involvement, and our commitment to involve them throughout the process. And later on in the slide, I'll talk about it in the slide deck. I'll talk about it. But that involved us building mock rooms for them to come in and give us their input to see how the space was going to work for them, to get some inputs on furniture and serving utensils and doorknobs. And as much as we could involve our residents and their families in that process, we needed to be able to do so. Now, unfortunately, many of them openly recognize that I may not ever see this magical place that you're involving me in, but the pride that they showed in being able to be part of the project and shape what long-term care will be for their peers in the future really brought them a lot of satisfaction. We also had to educate other stakeholders, and that included our staff members and included our regulatory representatives here in the state of Maine, to make sure that they were understanding of where we were going, why we were going there, and what those expectations were along the way. That included our certificate of need, project approvals, securing of our funding, and then our RFP and contracting with the project team. One of the organizational missions that we had throughout the project, because again, we were new to the state of Maine, was to utilize resources across the country that had done projects like this in the past, but partner with local entities to make sure that we could provide an opportunity for shared learning. So our construction team was out of Wisconsin. They were paired with a construction team here in Maine. Our architectural firm was out of Wisconsin. They again were paired with an architectural firm here in the state of Maine, so that we could have some cross-pollination with this expertise, in the hopes that if it's not us, it's somebody else in the future that will be embarking on a similar project. So as you can see on the bottom, construction started in 2019, and we achieved substantial completion in 2021. Now, July of 2021 was substantial completion. That does not mean that the building was ready for us. That means the building was substantially completed enough that they could check the box and sign the paperwork. Work continued through 2021, and in January of 2022, the building was truly set and ready for us to train and move our residents and families and staff members in. We began training in the winter of 2022, and we moved in on March 22nd, 2022. So all that process was going on in the midst of the pandemic. We were living in an institutional setting. We were living through what most nursing homes had to do over the course of the pandemic. And then we had the grace and luxury of moving into a small house setting in the waning days of the pandemic, which was a game changer. We saw so many impacts on infection control, the spread of staff and having less people congregated together. The same thing for our residents, our ability to manage outbreaks very quickly and timely in a setting like this. It was a complete game changer, and being able to manage the pandemic in both settings, obviously I have a preference moving forward. Next slide, please, Sarah. So our interior architecture and the design was really twofold. One, at the center was resident experience. We wanted to be able to make this as much of a home as we possibly could. But there are also healthcare outcomes that are happenstance from a setting like this. So improved nutrition, preventing falls, the reduction of infection and antipsychotic drug use, behaviors for folks who have cognitive deficits. A lot of the design characteristics of our home were done to accommodate improvement in each of these sections. Now, as we began this process and we're working with our residents on how to what they were going to anticipate in this new home, one of the challenges that we came across was, after occupancy, there was a culture change for our residents and their families. Families were looking for balloon toss to be played. We don't do balloon toss because our residents don't want to do balloon toss. They were looking for, large groups of staff members, as you typically see in a nurse's station. But we don't have a nurse's station. So it took some time for us to acclimate our families and our residents to this world. And that was not something that we could do before. we could talk about the model, we could talk about the building, we could educate them as much as we could until they're physically in the space and living in the space with us. That's when those understanding or those questions really started to come up. And it was an opportunity for us to really, embrace what we had done in the midst of a pandemic and able to bring people together. And one of those opportunities that we were really missing. We would have loved to, prior to moving in, have an opportunity to bring our family members into the building, but the pandemic and social distancing and those dynamics really handcuffed us in a lot of those ways. Next slide, please. So at the core of what we do, and I had mentioned it earlier, is nothing about me without me. And that's really one of our core concepts. It applies first and foremost to our residents. If we're making decisions that are affecting them, we have to involve them in those decisions. But it also involves our staff members, our frontline approach to leadership, our empowered workforce, our collaborative democracy that we have. Really right at the core of that is nothing about me without me. Now, I had mentioned that we had done mock rooms. We did 2 different mock rooms, evaluating the physical footprint of the room, bring in different residents that have different care needs. Somebody with a power chair, somebody with, prosthetics. Are they able to utilize the space as appropriate? Do they have recommendations? Making sure that they had an opportunity to identify wear points, identify spots that weren't going to work for us, and then the equipment that we use as well. We also did a mock kitchen so that our families, residents, and staff could see what is a pretty drastic change to our typical institutional approach to the dining program. A completely decentralized approach to dining is something that no one really anticipates when they check into a nursing home for the last time. And when we had the opportunity to walk through with staff, walk through with our residents, and talk about what their experience is going to be, really brought a lot of value to all those parties, knowing where we were going to be headed, and the stark change from our approach to what is our normal dining program. Now, that physical plant change obviously is pretty significant. But along with that physical plant change, there is also the change in philosophy, the change in how we do things and why we do things that are equally as important. And as I talk to folks and I do tours in our building, I am as open with pointing out the philosophical changes that anybody can do in any setting, and quite frankly, in any industry, that will be equally as impactful as the physical plant. The physical plant, no doubt, is an outstanding platform, but it is a platform. It is the philosophy and the theory around leadership and what we do for our residents and why we do it that really creates all of the magic. Next slide, please, Sarah. So I had mentioned our residents not wanting to be trapped in their homes. You can build me a beautiful home, but if you don't let me out, I'm trapped. There's nowhere to go, nothing to do. And we wanted to make sure that we gave them that space. So our community center, where all of our homes are attached to, has a movie theater, has a main street, has a coffee shop and sandwich shop and bistro. We have an ice cream parlor. We actually have a chapel, which really has taken on a life of its own. It is now their town church. We have a small choir group that has formed from different representatives from residents from their respective houses. We've had 2 weddings so far. We've had a number of celebrations of life. So there is a living, breathing component to our community center that we would have missed if we didn't really involve our residents right from the get-go. One thing not pictured is our Veterans Club. So we do have a bar and pub for our folks with veterans. The social community that they have in the community is very, very, very big. So your VFWs, your American Legions, your Eagles Club, and because they come to us, it doesn't give us the right to take that away, which is part of the fabric of who they are. So we have a Veterans Club, which now operates like the local VFW here within our home, and it breathes life in and out of those doors every single day. As we talked about the impact of giving the residents what they had hoped for, there's also a profound impact on the quality outcomes, preventing falls, being active, promoting independence, and all of that through wellness and their engagement in their world. If there aren't things to do, they will become sedentary. If you provide them with a wheelchair when they walk in the door, they will use that wheelchair and they will not walk anymore. If your design around your physical plant makes things accessible to them, they will remain, more independent for a longer period of time. Now, briefly about our home, we have 12 houses on our campus. We have 4 different levels of care. To answer, one of the questions locally about the dynamic of acuity and those sorts of things, and who are the right people to live in a small house model or in a greenhouse model. Anybody can live in a small house model or greenhouse model, and almost everybody is going to thrive, in those settings. 4 of our houses are secured memory care houses. We have 10 residents that live on each one of those houses. So your typical dementia unit that you see in a nursing home, we have 4 houses that make up that care village. We have 4 houses that are long-term care. They have 12 residents apiece that live on each one of those houses. We have an assisted living that has 15 residents on each one of those houses. And then we also have a skilled rehab, 2 houses that make up our skilled rehab, and those are 10 residents apiece. Each of the care villages have nuances to the physical plant based on the level of assistance or the characteristics of their needs. So we have ceiling lifts in each one of the private rooms for our residents on long-term care and skilled. We have piped in wall oxygen and suction on 5 of our skilled rooms on each of our houses due to the high level of acuity of the folks that we care for there. Our memory care house has a silent alarm system that's tunable. So if we have a resident who is great during the daytime and can be up on their own, however, staff need to know when they're moving around in their room at nighttime, we can adjust that so that it alerts staff silently on their handheld devices and they can respond to the residents. So we make sure that through the use of technology, we're also doing the best we can for our residents and not utilizing those institutional staples that we know to come and loathe. Now, we don't have nurse stations. We don't have med carts. We don't have those typical institutional sounds and sights. The environment is immersive. When you walk onto one of the houses, you hear the laundry going. You hear dishes being put away in the kitchen. You smell food being prepared in the kitchen, things that you would feel and see and smell and hear in your own home, so that the environment is immersive and you don't have those reminders that you're in an institutional setting.
Hey, Jake.
Yes.
Hey, Jake, can we finish up in just a couple minutes? We have more questions, I think, and also another few comments from Barbara.
Sure. Go ahead and on to the next slide.
Yep.
So I'll try to go through quickly our collaborative democracy, as the previous presentation outlined. Equally as important to have ownership and buy-in from the team members that you have, from leadership down to frontline staff. There are different components to that, and I had mentioned to Lauren that I'm happy to talk more about the stabilization of workforce that's created in a model like this, because it is absolutely huge, and we've seen a pretty significant impact. Next slide, please, Sarah. Talking briefly about our operational change. Preparation began in our old building in the institutional setting with educating our staff members and our other stakeholders on the model, changing what we could in an institutional setting to avoid having to change everything when we came over to the new setting. Planning involving all of our staff members, and then our outcomes. You'll see Mr. Wilson right there, who happens to be fishing underneath the rainbow, but we have a trout pond, and Mr. Wilson is an avid fly fisherman. So as he checked into our nursing home, he was able to maintain who he was. So he spends a couple days a week tying his flies, and then a couple days a week he goes out and fly fishes on our pond. Next slide, please, Sarah. So briefly through our outcomes, since occupancy in March of 2022, we have seen a 29% reduction in falls. We have seen a pretty drastic change in the use of antipsychotics from a high point in 2020 of 22.3 down to 4.3 through second quarter here in 2023. Stabilizations of sleep patterns, of weights, behaviors of some of our residents who have cognitive deficits. We have also seen since 2019, and again, mind you, through a pandemic, an increase of 56% to our total FTEs, or our staffing here in our home. Turnover rates have decreased by over a quarter, vacancy rate down to 8.9, and I am currently experiencing a wait list for 2 of our 3 shifts for staff to come here and work. On to our next slide, please. So for us, the journey continues. You can skip that one because Gene is more important. So back to Gene. Go on the next slide, Sarah. Jean is one of our residents here, and she lives on one of our long-term care houses. Her chef, Ashley, meets with her residents on a weekly basis to review their specific menu on their specific house. Jean was a homemaker for 60 years and had 60 years worth of recipes that she brought in, was able to talk with her chef and weave some of her family recipes into the menu for her specific house. So again, involving our residents in day-to-day life, day-to-day operations, anything that involves them, we try to involve them as much as possible. And Jean is a great example of that. On to the next slide. And again, so the journey continues. We are now in the hardwiring phase of our world. How do we avoid that creep back to institutional living? Our next phase of that is continue to educate others and share our learnings as we move forward.
It was so great, Jake. I'm sorry I had to cut you off or move you along. I guess I have a quick question for you myself that, you know, with both Susan and you sort of highlighted the impact that these models can have on staff stability. Either of you seen any improvements in cost or savings as a result of that, with knowing how much you all spend on, you know, recruiting and training new staff?
Yeah, we are in Augusta, Maine. It's not a huge market. It is not you know, a place where there are more staff than we know what to do with. So the ability to recruit and retain, you know, is a pretty significant victory. You know, turnover rates that are not just specific to us, but small house and greenhouse models that are extremely low or non-existent. There's a huge cost associated with turnover. We have no agency staff. We have not had agency staff in quite some time. So those components are pretty profound. And you can Google the different costs associated with, you know, turnover, the average cost of a position and how much it costs. Again, like I said, I have a wait list for 2 of the 3 shifts, you know, for not just clinical, but for our support teams as well.
Any thoughts on that question, Susan?
Yeah, I would concur with much of what he's saying. I think the other thing when you're looking at labor costs in general, you can really, and you had a slide talking about the reduction of FTEs, and I think that's absolutely spot on in what we've learned as well, and how you gain kind of that efficiency with the team. I have one of our greenhouse leaders, she said, you can't half jump, you've got to fully commit to the model that's really flattening the hierarchy. And then that really enables you to kind of pay a living wage and to really support those that are in the home, the direct care.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I had a gathering of administrators and directors of nursing at a national conference about a year or 2 ago. We had 40 people at that level, and we asked them, how many of you keep track of the cost of turnover? There's 1 person in the room. So I think one of the things that would actually be helpful is for people to be more aware, administrators to be more aware of what they're actually losing by not retaining staff. I mean, there's so much focus on recruiting and so much less focus on retention. And this might be, as Susan rightly said, some incentive to look a little more closely at that. There are things we know you can do, and these are certainly models that help, but there are other things that people can do to retain, and it's not getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, I agree with you, Barbara. And I think some of the core concepts around leadership, you know, really are galvanizing, you know, for retention practices. You know, when my team, and I talk about an orientation, when they come around a corner of one of the houses and they see me, the administrator, cooking breakfast for the residents, you know, we're doing what we say we're going to be doing. And, you know, it really is a galvanizing factor, you know, when that's something that is now predictable and part of the culture. You know, versus something that some folks just never see.
Right.
I see some comments in the chat about the issue of staff turnover. Ruta, did you want to add anything to your written? No.
No, just I was talking with folks from Maine Center for Economic Policy yesterday, and that was a figure they cited that you know, sort of not unique to this industry, but that they use about 40% of the person's annual cost as a typical cost associated with turnover.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Gail, did you have something you wanted to add to your written comments?
No, just if homes are interested, we have a no-cost staff stability toolkit that has worksheets in it that let people quickly analyze what turnover is costing them, where it's happening, is it particular units, particular shifts, how long after hire, et cetera. It also, of course, in addition to the worksheets, includes a lot of information on things people can do to increase stability and retention.
Right, great.
Is that available? I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Barbara, I don't know if your camera is off or it looks like there's something on your screen.
Oh, yep.
There
Sorry
you
about
are.
that.
Yeah. So you've been listening to our discussion and our presenters here. I'm interested to hear your high level, low level, any type of comments that you might have for us today.
Actually, some high and low level. One of the things I wanted to do is add a little bit of maybe depth to some of the comments here. I had the privilege of doing quite a bit of research in the greenhouse homes and national and more local projects. But I think some of the things Jake talked about, many of the things Jake talked about, as well as what Susan presented, have some things in common. So first thing I want to say is I think that what we've been hearing about is a really very skillful integration of quality of life and quality of care. Because what I hear from residents, and I know the literature is filled with this, is that the default is to focus on clinical, whether it's a surveyor or what you report or what you hold staff accountable for, is clinical outcomes with very little attention to quality of life. And a lot of staff say there's just not time to do that. The resident focus group I've been working with says they default to clinical outcomes. They don't care about quality of life. And it's not that they don't care, but they run out of time. And I think one of the things that this model does is it integrates those things in a way that can't be separated. And so when you're doing one thing, you're doing the other. When you're working on quality of life, it influences clinical outcomes. When you're working on clinical outcomes, it influences quality of care. And let me just give a couple of examples. Nutrition, which Jake mentioned, and I know Susan showed the dining table. Some of the, as you all know, common complaints from nursing home residents are the food is no good, the hot things that are supposed to be hot are cold, I don't get any choice. In both settings, Jake showed this as well as Susan, the residents get to bring recipes and have something to say about it. If they sit down at the table and they don't like what's there, there's a kitchen right next to them where something else can be prepared quickly. So there's a huge amount of choice. What does this do? I know in the greenhouse, there was no more weight loss. There was weight gained by the staff who I ate with them, which was a little bit of an unexpected side effect, but it really had a huge impact on the nutritional status of the residents. The other thing that it did was families were welcome to come and have a meal. And so that sort of, it addresses loneliness, social isolation, the importance of family relationships and staff relationships when the staff have a meal with. I mean, a meal is a social event, but it's also important for nutrition. So integrating family, staff, food choice, and timing when they want it, and having residents at a small table with not a lot of noise. Noise is a bigger problem in long-term care settings than I think is generally recognized. It was one of the things that I know the residents I talked to mentioned over and over and over again. Noise during meals means you can't hear the person next to you. Tanya Roberts has done some great research on looking at the resident-to-resident relationships. And so in each of these settings, this allows the resident relationships, the connection to families, the better nutrition, the enjoyment of a meal and choice. And one other thing I'll add, and this also has to do with worker autonomy. In one of the greenhouse homes, and I imagine this could probably happen in the homes that Jake is connected with, but in one of the homes, there was a resident who was having trouble swallowing. The staff was concerned about it. Instead of turning that into a medical procedure, they invited the speech pathologist to come and have a meal with them and to observe the person while they were eating a meal. Much less intrusive, because they knew the woman would object, would have be frightened by medical interventions that she was confused about. And it was a wonderful way for the pathologist to just sit, the speech pathologist to just watch, listen to her, and then make some recommendations to the staff about how to modify some of the food that they were giving her. So I think that's one of the examples of autonomy of staff that is quite, it feels, I mean, that was the Shabazz or the CNA's initiative to do that. And so I think with models like this, what happens is you bubble up innovation from everybody. I don't think staff CNAs in most nursing homes feel empowered to be innovative, which gets me to the whole notion of innovation or empowerment. It was a challenge to figure out, what does empowerment mean? And I know in the greenhouse, there were some interesting situations where it probably wasn't interpreted very well. It was more like we do it on our own. That's completely, and you can understand how that happens when somebody who has felt really oppressed for a long time also all of a sudden gets some power. They could sort of the greenhouse has done a beautiful job of connecting the nurses and the Shabazine to figure out how are we empowered together. And it turns out it means collaboration and innovation that's recognized by the staff, innovation from the direct care workers. So we saw things like a young man who was very skilled at, he was very calm, he connected to the residents. And again, this is something with the connected to the meal. He had a table full of people who all had dementia at one stage or another. And what he was able to do was to connect with each of them personally, learned about their personal biographies, got a book about the local area, and learned where each person lived, what they had done with their life, and read passages out of this book, same one every night, but they didn't remember. And as someone would get a little bit agitated, he would put a hand on their shoulder and read a passage in the book that connected to their personal childhood. Those things are possible when the staff doesn't turn over and when there is real effort to have consistent staffing, which I think it cannot be overstated, the importance of consistent staffing. I will never forget the woman who said to me, not in one of these places, but in a more traditional nursing home, I started by telling the staff member, the girl, how to move my leg without causing me pain. And she left, so I explained it to the next person. And she left, and I explained it to the next person at great effort. And by the fourth person, she said, I don't do that anymore. It just takes too much effort. I just accept that they don't know how to do it and it's going to cause me pain, and it would just get through it. Those are the sorts of things you leave behind in a model like this. What else did I want to say here? I think the small house also creates some opportunities that other places don't have. Let's take mobility for one. Both of you talked about the improvement in mobility status. So we wondered when we went into the greenhouse home, what is it that does this? One of the most frequent things we heard from the staff was, well, when I worked in a nursing home, you'd take a person, say we're going to lunch, we're going to the dining room. It would take this person so long to walk there. I don't really have time because then other people have to wait, or it's too long, they get too tired and they might fall on the way. When you have small spaces like this and you don't go very far, walking is much less intimidating. So you do a lot more of it. So I think that to me, the striking thing about these models is the integration and the mutual support for quality of life and quality of care. I'm remembering from the residents that I've been talking to in the focus group, a comment that one of them made, and she said, I have been poor all my life, and I come into a nursing home, and I think it's utterly unfair that people with money get private rooms and private bathrooms, and I get stuck having to share everything. And she said, it's just one more way to show that I'm less valuable than somebody else. I love the fact that in these models, everybody is equal. There is no hierarchy. People with money can't buy better privileges that are really very obvious to everybody else. The other thing, I've been reading some research lately about what gets people in nursing homes to get involved in activities, which are, as you know, so important to people in long-term care settings. And one of the most powerful influencers on that is that you actually have some private space. If you have private space and you can spend time in your private space, you're much more willing to gather with other people. If in fact you never have private space, the last thing you want to do is go into a group of people and have another place where you don't have any private space. So it's something I actually hadn't thought about before, but it certainly makes sense. What else did I want to say? I think, one of the other things, I know this wasn't part of the presentation, but I wanted to say, I think the investment in the direct care worker is so vital in this, in nursing home care. The Shabazine that we talked about learning life skills, learning from each other, learning, and then one of the things I deal with conflicts, because unlike traditional models, when there's a dispute between CNAs, the nurse gets involved and deals with it, or when there's a staffing problem. In this model, and I don't know how those homes operate, I expect it's fairly similar. The Shabazine or the CNAs have to figure that out on their own. That's a real personal professional growth experience. And while it might be painful, they actually are thrilled at their new level of skills that they take into their lives. And I remember, even learning cooking. I remember one young woman saying, I just got married. I didn't know how to cook a thing. My husband was absolutely disgusted. But being a Shabazine in this greenhouse, there was an older woman, a Shabazine, who taught her how to cook. And so she said, life is great now. So the professional growth, the personal growth, and things that can be applied to the person's life in general, those things help retention a lot. It makes people feel valued. It makes them feel like they're being invested in and they have something to gain. And I think the last thing that I want to say here is that this is a wonderful model for nurses. When you have direct care workers who are more connected and understand better what people need and can collaborate much more easily with the nurses are freed from doing a lot of the tasks, from doing a lot of the disciplining, the scheduling, but as well as in individual tasks, and are allowed to do more in terms of nursing care. And I'll leave you with one example that I thought is a wonderful example of how we are better able to see change in condition early. There was a Shabazine who said she watched someone sort of leaning against a wall as the nurse was giving her medication for the morning. And as she walked away, she said to the nurse, something's going on with her. Something's not right. And the nurse said, how do you know? And she said, because she usually stands up straight and I see her leaning against the wall. So there's something, what a tiny little thing. And she was brewing an infection. So there is a much higher, and I think that's why these homes see a lower hospitalization rate, is the link between all of the different things that the Shabazine and the CNAs are doing with these residents gives them much quicker information about very subtle changes in condition, which, as we know in this population, is sort of life and death often. So I will end with that. I'm very excited about these models. And so thank you, both of you, for doing this.
Any final thoughts from our speakers? Jake, Susan?
The only thing I'll mention is, I could have talked probably for, I toured you, and that was like an hour and a half tour with you and Paul, maybe even a little bit longer. And that was just a tour, not really getting into strategies on stabilizing our workforce or what we've done to reduce polypharmacy and, the different concepts that we embrace, the leadership pieces to it all. It is a onion of a world that we live in the small house model. And it really is the sum of all the pieces to make everything work and work well.
Yep. Jake, would probably like to hear from some of your staff sometime, one of these upcoming sessions. to get
They would
some.
love to talk.
Yeah, good. Ruta?
I just, I mean, obviously I'm a believer, but I really appreciated the stories, and I really appreciated, Barbara, the vignettes you shared from the research, because I think we tend to focus quickly on like, oh, all this has got to be so much more expensive, but all of those things you cited actually have cost implications too. And if we can sort of harness and understand how those things interplay within a system, you know, they aren't necessarily cost the facility saves, but how those interplay within a system, so that the funding can be directed to where it best supports good quality of care and good quality of life. I truly believe there are savings to be had.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Looks like Gail has a comment.
Yep.
I'll be real quick. I just wanted to circle back on the comments on clinical outcomes. So admittedly, this was when sort of culture change sorts of topics were in its infancy. But when we did the national pilot several years back, we never once at any learning session throughout the entire year talked about clinical topics, but we tracked their clinical outcomes for 2 years after the end of the project. And the improvement was overwhelmingly positive in a number of the areas that you cited: weight loss, antipsychotic use, falls. We looked at things like resident to resident incidents and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to reinforce that. The other thing is Jake mentioned, you know, educating the stakeholders, and I just wanted to say that one of the things that came up repeatedly when we were working with homes is they were oftentimes afraid of jumping into this with both feet, because they were afraid that they were somehow stepping outside survey guidelines or regulatory guidelines. And so just to reinforce, you know, working closely, developing a partnership, if you will, with your local survey agency, so that you can have conversations before you embark on things, so that you're not undoing things or redoing things. And the last thing I want to say is we worked with this home in Manhattan, Kansas, that had a household model, and one of the things that they did that was so interesting to me was they created this tremendous porousness with the community. Like they held art shows and local groups that didn't have space to meet. You know, they were holding Girl Scout meetings in their space, and it really sort of changed the dynamic for how people looked at the nursing home and how people felt about older folks. And so I just thought that was worth mentioning. Great presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thanks for those comments, Gail. Paul, I think you have about 22 seconds for any final closing comments.
Certainly want to thank you, Susan, Jake, and Barbara, for your great information. I did visit Jake's facility, and it is easy to fall in love with this model the minute you step into it. But I think in addition to the attributes of the model, what you all gave us today was a lot more evidence, both in terms of cost and quality. I think it's not only about cost, it's about value. And clearly these models just, I believe, deliver a lot more value. That's the direction we're heading in with payment reform in Maine. So it's an opportunity. I see Bill Monteo on the line, our licensing director. He's familiar with the model now, having gone through the process with Jake of licensing the Augusta home. So we have that experience. I think having a real place on the ground so people can see this is possible. It's all very exciting and a real opportunity for us in Maine to move in this direction. Coming up, we want to do more innovation. So if you have ideas, both in terms of what you're doing in your organization or other national models that you've encountered that you would like us to feature, we're happy to put together more panels of this type. Next time, I think we're going to have a focus on staff, and we're going to hear from some staff. And so that's very exciting. Brenda's helping us identify some folks. And we're thinking that it would be really good to keep the legislature informed about the work of this group. This has been the quality of the conversation here has been so great, and yet here we are, 15 or 20 people, right? And so, how do we start to disseminate and start to educate others about the direction that we're all embracing? So we're thinking, although we're not mandated to report out, we're thinking of preparing a status update of some kind that we will want your input on, that we can then let the legislature know about this work and try to think about where it leads us as a state. So with that, thank you all. I've now kept you 2 minutes over, and we will look forward to talking with you again next month.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.